All right. So this one, yeah, you've already said the title, Centurion Me. If driving a spike beneath the shadow of a branch reminds you of the worst thing you've done in the history of shadows and branches, like an animal praying to the burial god, it's doubtful forgiveness will flower and seed the yard with redemption's red cape. Not at this point in your life or day, whichever has caused you the greatest grief, kissing the ground with a hammer's lips. Like all animals who call themselves men before giving up the ghost, midday in a pool of sweat and clover, you'll find the time to pound the earth's vein with another delicious nail. Centurion me, Centurion. So good. So once again, this one I was caught. I mean, this one I read also several times, and similar to the last piece, they're using Centurion as, is it Centurion or Centurion? I'm not sure how to say that correctly. One of the two, but Centurion maybe, used it as a verb, and that's not a normal verb. And that leads you to question, okay, what exactly are you wanting this person to do? Like what's that office? And and also looking it up, Centurion is a Roman soldier. This is also the centurions, if I'm correct, were the ones that were in charge of nailing Christ to the cross. Like that was sort of their, like they were the Roman soldiers specifically who did that, because there was a little bit of that imagery in here, redemption's red cape, driving a spike. And so there was very much some religious imagery in here. It was just fascinating, especially the first part. If driving a spike beneath the shadow of a branch reminds you of the worst thing you've done in the history of shadows and branches, that's just a great line and leads to more thought. And it's like, well, what do you mean? And then it's like, wait, hang on, is this the soldier that nailed Christ to the cross, and is that the worst thing he's ever done? And so now every time he has to do some sort of manual labor that requires a similar action, that's bringing it up in his mind, or is this someone else who not necessarily has done the awful thing, but they said like an animal praying to the burial god, wanting forgiveness, not able to get it, thinking of the worst thing that they've ever done and thinking that forgiveness is a long way off. And yeah, and then also the image kissing the ground with a hammer's lips. I had to think through that one. I was like, you're just hammering the ground? Are you that's still one that is sort of like a little bit of a head scratcher, but that's just that's very different imagery of kissing, which is something that's very gentle, and a hammer, like you're hammering the ground. Yeah, and then giving up the ghost in a pool of sweat and clover. That's an interesting one, because clover is usually an herb that's used to heal things. That's, and back in the days, I think it was used as an antiseptic. Like that was something not only that people would smoke, but was like an antibacterial, thing. You'll find the time to pound the earth's vein with another delicious nail. Like this one sort of sends me in circles, but it's in a way that I like. Like there's so much imagery and there's so much to think about that this one's just so good. And then Centurion me as a verb. So are you asking someone to well, that sounds sexual. Are you asking someone to hammer you, but like, or drive a stake into your arm, or are you asking someone to maybe subdue you in some way? That's just, I don't know. There's I feel like there's so many layers of meanings in here that it's hard to pick just one, because it leads to as many questions as it does answers. But that's kind of why I like it.
Yeah, I found this one kind of, definitely interesting and engaging, but there is that difficulty layer, like it's a little bit difficult to really pin down. I was gonna say nail down, but like it's too much like nailing. But like,
Yeah.
yes, it's kind of difficult just to like put a really clear reading on it. But yeah, you're right. Some of the language and the imagery is just interesting to get into, just to wonder about.
It's very
And
evocative, like it
I love,
elicits an emotional response.
I love that word. Yeah. Um, I got, I got two, like a week apart, I got like two responses or messages, um, that said the word evocative, like my work was evocative. So I'm gonna start using that all the time
It's a
now.
great word. It
Yeah.
evokes something.
Yeah. And
It elicits a response.
yeah, and then just the first stanza, you're kind of waiting when you're reading a lot of poems and stuff like that, you're kind of just waiting for that little hook, just that something interesting and just that repetition. It's not, it's not flashy or anything, but just the repetition of like the shadow of a branch reminds you of the worst thing you've done in the history of shadows and branches for whatever reason. I don't know if it's like on a technical level or just that repetition. It was just an interesting enough way to phrase it, and that repetition was engaging for me. So then I kind of had a positive reading of this poem just from the first stanza with that little twist. Um, and then yeah, with the rest of the imagery, was kind of interesting to get into.
Yeah.
Does
And
anybody
then,
know?
oh, sorry, no, you go for it.
I was gonna say, does anybody remember a movie? I might be getting the title wrong, called The Red Robe, like with Tony Curtis, 1950s. Because there's this weird intersection when you see Red Cape, Redemption's Red Cape. Immediately I go to Superman, but of course Superman is a Christ figure, the Red Cape, and a lot of the iconography and mythology of Superman is a Christ image. But this movie, I think, focuses on the soldier who actually did the deed and got the nails driven into the deliciousness driven into the earth's vein. And I wondered if it's kind of like an echo, a triple mythology echo factor going on.
Yeah, that very well could be. Well, in the line, all animals who call themselves men. That's an interesting one. That's almost like a little bit derogatory, but like also, I don't know, trying to be an equalizer because everyone dies eventually. I don't know. That's an interesting one. Giving up the ghost obviously is a very specific like religious phrase. Like giving up the ghost, that's you'll find the time to pound the earth's vein with another delicious nail. Delicious nail is a weird way to describe a nail, especially if you're talking about a crucifixion. Like, how could a nail be delicious? So,
Well, if we want to get a little technical, I would describe myself as an atheist Catholic. I have all of the guilt, but none of the handy mechanisms to get rid of it. But I've got steeped in a lot of that mythology and the idea
right.
that it was the necessity of Christ to sacrifice and to pay all of the credit card debt forward. And so the deliciousness is kind of like a hunger to create that need for a human sacrifice. So there's an interesting little echo going on there too.
That is very interesting.
Thanks for clarifying that. I do not have a religious background in the sense to like fully get some of the multiple layers here. But when I was reading it, for the first part of the poem, I felt like I was reading this really scathing indictment of someone else, that the narrator was talking to someone else. And then midway through the poem, like, oh, he's speaking to himself. And this is his indictment and his, to borrow your language, shame for his relationship and the worst thing that he's done in the history of shadows and branches and whatever he's nailing down. And he's describing himself as the animal praying to the burial god, and that forgiveness is not going to seed in his garden. And that he is still like going further down in the poem. The way that I read the last two stanzas was that he will continue to do what he's doing, that he is ashamed of or not, or seeking forgiveness for, and he hopes that it is done to him as well. And that's what the Centurion is like, this call of like, I've fucking sinned too, excuse my language, sorry if that's but he's sinned as well, and he wants to be, nailed in the same way for it.
Yeah,
And
that's
then
really
maybe-
interesting. I love that interpretation that you've done something awful that you feel guilty about. And then that guilt and that shame leads you to say, like, I wish someone would just like slaughter me, basically, so that I can, get what I deserve, or so that I can, get my comeuppance, essentially. And that's really interesting.
and
That
if
would
you-
also be another way to interpret delicious, because that's almost like you're getting that relief of not having to feel the guilt anymore, because you've paid your, like, if someone's like beaten the crap out of you or nailed you up, like you've sort of paid what you were guilty for. So now you get to be done. That's another way to interpret like the delicious meal. It's almost like the relief.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, I think we're at the epicenter of what a lot of Catholicism has to say about the sadomasochistic relationship between that kind of need for punishment or discipline. And if you want to put an erotic spin on it, it's maybe not a coincidence that they call it the Passion of the Christ.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's definitely interplay there.
I think
For
that's why we do these, because I wouldn't have like gotten to that interpretation on my own for sure. Putting those kind of layers to it.
Well, and there is a little bit of that place where erotic and violence are kind of like up
Oh yeah.
neck in this, the sweat and the clover, and just the language is so beautiful, even though they're talking about these really violent, something that feels very violent. I guess I'm just projecting. I'm like, well, that's clearly erotic.
Well, no, I
I
think you're exactly right. I mean, the line "kissing the ground with a hammer's lips," that's clearly an intersection between, right, something that's passionate and something that's violent. Because if you're smashing a hammer on the ground, there's, yeah, like that's. I think you're spot on.
Nice. Yeah, so another good one. Thanks for selecting that. So yeah, Daniel Edward Moore. Well done.